January 17, 1944. 29,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. The air at this altitude was not simply cold, it was a kind of cold that burned. A cold that turned breath into daggers of ice in the lungs, that made the skin beneath leather flight suits feel as though it had been replaced with frozen parchment. Lieutenant Tokishi Yamamoto pressed his oxygen mask tighter against his face, feeling the rubber seal bite into wind-chapped skin. Through the curved glass canopy of his Mitsubishi A6M0, he could see them, 23 American B-17 Flying Fortresses, droning westward in their unshakable box formations, their aluminum fuselages catching the morning sun like a fleet of mechanical gods. They were headed toward Rabaul, toward his homeland's vital supply lines, toward everything the Empire had fought so desperately to hold in these endless island chains. But it was not the bombers that made his hands tighten on the control stick. It was what flanked them. Rising above the bomber stream, still climbing, impossibly climbing, were the silver specks of their escort fighters, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, moving higher with a confidence that seemed to mock the very laws of aerial warfare that Yamamoto had been taught since his first days at the Tsukiura Naval Air Corps. The altimeter needle in his cockpit trembled at 28,500 feet. His engine was beginning to stutter. Through the tactical radio, he could hear the labored breathing of his squadron mates, the slight slur in their transmissions that meant hypoxia was beginning its insidious work. They had trained for high-altitude interception. They had studied the American bomber formations with religious intensity. But no one had prepared them for this, for escorts that simply refused to stop climbing, that seemed to treat the death zone above 30,000 feet not as a ceiling but as another battlefield to be conquered. Yamamoto pushed his throttle forward, coaxing every possible revolution from his Seiki engine. The Zero responded with a shudder. At 29,200 feet, his rate of climb became a crawl. The thunderbolts above were now clearly visible, their distinctive razorback profiles silhouetted against the deepening blue of the stratosphere, and they were still ascending. This was the moment, replicated across hundreds of encounters throughout 1943 and 1944, when Japanese and German fighter pilots began to understand that they were not fighting the same war they had trained for. They were confronting something unprecedented in the history of aerial combat, an adversary whose industrial capacity had translated into such overwhelming technical superiority that traditional tactics, courage, and skill were being rendered obsolete by simple mechanical advantage. The Americans could go higher, stay longer, hit harder, and return home. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that determination alone could do to bridge that gap. The doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, refined through the crucible of China and perfected in the shocking victories of 1941 and early 1942, had been built upon a philosophy of elegant efficiency. Every ounce of weight was sacrificed to maximize range, maneuverability, and climb rate. The Zero fighter was a masterpiece of aeronautical minimalism. No armor plating for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant systems. It was a weapon designed for a specific kind of war, one where superior training, superior tactics, and superior spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. In the hands of the pre-war veteran pilots who struck Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines, it had been devastating. Those men, the Tainan Air Group, the legendary 3rd Air Group, had accumulated thousands of hours in the air. They flew their Zeros like samurai wielded katana, with an intimacy that made man and machine indistinguishable. But those men were dead now. Most of them had fallen into the Coral Sea, burned over Midway, or simply disappeared into the vastness of the Pacific during the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal. The pilots who climbed into Zeros and Oscars and Jacks in 1944 were younger, hastily trained, and they were flying aircraft that had changed remarkably little since 1940 while the enemy they faced had undergone a revolution. The American escort fighters that began appearing in substantial numbers in 1943, first the P-38 Lightning, then the P-47 Thunderbolt, and later the P-51 Mustang, were built upon a fundamentally different philosophy. They were products of an industrial nation that could afford to add weight for survivability, that could install turbo superchargers and sophisticated oxygen systems because there were factories that could manufacture such systems by the thousands. The P-47 Thunderbolt, in particular, was an almost obscene demonstration of American abundance. Weighing over 7 tons fully loaded, nearly 3 times the weight of a Zero, it was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. But the critical innovation was the General Electric turbo supercharger, a complex system that used exhaust gases to drive a turbine that compressed intake air, allowing the engine to maintain power at altitudes where normally aspirated engines gasped for breath. The result was a fighter that actually became more dominant the higher it climbed. At 30,000 feet, where a Zero's engine produced barely 60% of its sea-level power, the Thunderbolt's engine was still generating nearly full thrust. And it carried something else that Japanese pilots could only dream of, a demand oxygen system that provided pure oxygen to the pilot automatically, regulated by altitude and breathing rate, reliable up to 40,000 feet. Japanese aircraft had oxygen systems, of course. But they were primitive by comparison, low-pressure systems that required pilots to manually adjust flow rates, that provided diluted oxygen mixed with ambient air, and that became dangerously unreliable above 28,000 feet. Worse, the quality of the oxygen itself varied wildly depending on supply chains that were being systematically destroyed by American submarines. By 1944, Japanese pilots often flew combat missions with oxygen systems that were marginally functional at best, catastrophically deficient at worst. So when Lieutenant Yamamoto watched those Thunderbolts continue to climb past 30,000 feet on that January morning, he was witnessing more than just superior engineering. He was seeing the physical manifestation of an economic war that Japan had already lost. Every one of those American fighters represented resources, industrial capacity, and technical sophistication that the Empire simply could not match. And every breath those American pilots took through their sophisticated oxygen masks was a breath that Japanese pilots were being denied by their own system's fatal limitations. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Japanese naval aviators were not merely brave, they were indoctrinated from their earliest training to view death in service to the emperor as the highest possible honor. The Bushido Code adapted for aerial warfare emphasized spirit over material, will over technology. It was an ethos that had served them well in the early months of the war, when their superior training and experience allowed them to dominate numerically superior but poorly prepared Allied forces. But there is a difference between accepting death as a possibility, even welcoming it as glorious, and being forced to fight at a systematic disadvantage so profound that survival becomes statistically impossible. By mid-1943, Japanese fighter pilots were increasingly confronting missions where American escorts simply refused to fight on terms that Japanese aircraft could match. The Americans would establish combat air patrol at 32,000 or 33,000 feet, altitudes where Japanese fighters could barely reach, let alone maneuver. From that high perch, the Thunderbolts and Lightnings could dive at will, using their superior high-altitude performance to build tremendous speed in vertical attacks, make a single devastating pass through a Japanese formation, and then zoom back up to their sanctuary altitude before the lighter, more maneuverable Zeros could respond. German Luftwaffe pilots on the eastern and western fronts were experiencing parallel revelations. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 were formidable fighters, products of the world's most technically sophisticated aviation industry. But they too were designed as interceptors for European conditions, aircraft optimized for rapid climb and devastating firepower in short-duration engagements over relatively short distances. When American heavy bomber formations began penetrating deep into German airspace in 1943, escorted by P-47s and later P-51s equipped with drop tanks that gave them escort range measured in hundreds of miles, German pilots faced the same horrible mathematics as their Japanese counterparts. The Luftwaffe developed specific tactical doctrines to cope with high-altitude American escorts. They would attempt to draw the escorts away from the bomber stream using small formations as bait, or they would try to strike from directly above, diving through the escort layer to hit the bombers before zooming back up. But these tactics required precise coordination and often resulted in German fighters burning through their limited fuel in repeated climbs, all while the American escorts circled comfortably at altitudes where they could maintain patrol for hours. Major Heinz Bahr, a Luftwaffe ace with 220 confirmed victories, described the fundamental frustration in a 1944 debriefing. "We are no longer fighting pilots. We are fighting fuel tanks and oxygen bottles and superchargers. The American sits at 10 kilometers altitude, his engine purring, his blood fully oxygenated, warm in his heated cockpit, and he waits. We must come up to him, our engines screaming, our vision narrowing from oxygen deprivation, our fuel gauges dropping, and when we arrive we have perhaps 2 minutes of combat capability before we must descend or die. This is not aerial combat. This is industrial murder." The physiological reality of high-altitude flight without adequate oxygen is brutal and unforgiving. The human body begins to experience measurable cognitive impairment at altitudes above 10,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. By 18,000 feet, reaction time slows, judgment becomes impaired, and peripheral vision begins to narrow. At 25,000 feet, without oxygen, unconsciousness occurs within 3 to 5 minutes. But the insidious danger of hypoxia is that it doesn't feel like suffocation. Instead, pilots report a sense of euphoria, of relaxation, even as their ability to perform critical tasks disintegrates. Japanese pilots attempting to intercept high-altitude American formations faced an impossible dilemma. To reach the bombers, they had to climb to altitudes where their oxygen systems struggled to provide adequate flow. During the climb, they would already begin experiencing mild hypoxia, just enough to slow their reflexes by milliseconds, to make their gunnery calculations slightly less accurate, to delay their recognition of threats. And then, when they finally reached engagement altitude, they would encounter escorts that were physiologically unimpaired, flying aircraft that were performing at peak efficiency. The combat records tell the story with brutal clarity. In engagements over a ball, truck, and the Marianas during 1944, Japanese fighters attempting high-altitude interception suffered loss rates exceeding 60% in many battles. American bomber crews reported watching Japanese fighters climb toward their formations, only to stall out thousands of feet below the escorts, or to arrive with such depleted energy states that they became easy targets for the Americans diving from above. One particularly documented engagement occurred on April 3, 1944, during an American raid on Hollandia. A formation of 54 Zeros and Oscars attempted to intercept a force of B-24 Liberators escorted by 48 P-38 Lightnings. The Japanese fighters, launched from forward airfields with partially depleted oxygen supplies due to chronic shortages, managed to climb to 27,000 feet. The Lightnings were patrolling at 32,000 feet. The result was a massacre. The American escorts dove through the Japanese formation in repeated passes, using their superior altitude advantage to build tremendous speed, their pilots breathing pure oxygen, their engines operating at full power. Japanese pilots, already suffering mild hypoxia and flying aircraft straining at the edge of their performance envelope, were systematically destroyed. 41 Japanese fighters were shot down. 3 American aircraft were lost, 2 to ground fire, 1 to operational causes. Not a single American escort was lost to Japanese fighters. There was a sound that American bomber crews came to recognize during these high-altitude missions. It was the sound of Japanese fighters straining to reach them, the high-pitched scream of Seiki and Ha-35 engines being pushed far beyond their designed operational limits, climbing at angles that bled away airspeed, clawing for every additional meter of altitude. And then, when the Japanese fighters finally reached the bomber stream's altitude, there would be a different sound, the deeper, thunderous roar of American radial engines diving, the escorts coming down from their high perch like predatory birds, and the sudden, sharp silence when a Japanese fighter's engine cut out, either from combat damage or simply from fuel starvation after the desperate climb. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway, a waist gunner on a B-17 flying missions over Germany in late 1943, recorded in his diary, "You almost feel sorry for them. You can see the German fighters climbing toward us, their noses pointed almost straight up, and you know they're giving everything they have. Sometimes they get close enough that we can see the canopy, see the pilot. And then our jugs, P-47 Thunderbolts, come screaming down from nowhere, from some altitude we can't even see, and it's over before it really begins. There's no glory in it. It's just mathematics. They can't reach us without burning all their fuel. They can't breathe up here the way our boys can. They're fighting gravity and altitude and their own machines, and only then do they have to fight us." This was a symbolic object that haunted Japanese and German pilots in their final years of the war, the oxygen mask of an American fighter pilot, that simple rubber and aluminum device connected to a sophisticated demand regulator and an unlimited supply of pure oxygen. It represented everything they were not, everything they could not have. It was abundance made tangible. While Japanese oxygen supplies were being interdicted by submarines, while German factories were being bombed into rubble, American factories were producing oxygen systems so reliable, so sophisticated, that pilots could fight at altitudes where the sky turned dark blue-black, where the curvature of the earth became visible, where breathing without technological assistance meant death in minutes. By early 1945, the disparity had become so extreme that Japanese commanders stopped attempting high-altitude interception altogether in many sectors. The few remaining experienced pilots were reserved for low-altitude attack missions or, increasingly, for kamikaze operations where altitude was irrelevant. The doctrine of aerial superiority through superior spirit had collided with the hard reality of thermodynamics, physiology, and industrial capacity, and it had shattered. There were moments, in the final months of the Pacific War, when American pilots encountered Japanese fighters at lower altitudes, at 15,000 or 18,000 feet, where Japanese aircraft could still perform respectably. In these engagements, the legendary maneuverability of the Zero would reassert itself. American pilots would find themselves in turning fights where the lighter Japanese aircraft could briefly match them, where courage and skill still mattered. But these encounters became increasingly rare, and they were always haunted by the knowledge that the Americans could simply choose to climb away, to return to their high sanctuary, and the Japanese could not follow. Captain Thomas Maguire, who would become one of America's highest-scoring aces before his death in January 1945, described this dynamic in a letter home. "The Jap pilots, the ones who survive long enough to get experienced, they're still dangerous if you meet them on their terms. But the thing is, we never have to meet them on their terms anymore. If a Zero gets on my tail at low altitude, I just point the nose up and firewall the throttle. I can climb at angles and speeds that would stall them out, and I can keep climbing until I'm so high they can't even see me anymore. Then I come back down when and where I choose. It must be the most frustrating thing in the world, to be in a fighter plane and have the enemy simply climb away from you and know there's nothing you can do about it." This was the transformation in aerial warfare that high-altitude escort capability represented. It removed the element of chance, the possibility that courage or skill alone might overcome material disadvantage. It turned aerial combat from a contest between warriors into an industrial process, where victory was determined by supply chains, factories, and engineering sophistication long before pilots ever strapped into their cockpits. The psychological toll on Axis pilots was documented in numerous post-war interviews and captured documents. German Luftwaffe pilot Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, shot down over France in July 1944, told his interrogators, "We were taught that National Socialism represented the triumph of will, that German technical genius was superior to the mongrel democracies. And then we would climb to intercept, our oxygen masks barely functioning, our engines losing power, and we would watch Americans cruising at altitudes we couldn't reach, in fighters that seemed to have no operational ceiling, no endurance limit. Every mission became a lesson in the lie we had been told. They had more of everything, more planes, more fuel, more ammunition, more oxygen, more life." The engineering specifications tell their own story, dry and statistical but devastating in their implications. The Mitsubishi A6M50, the most advanced variant deployed in significant numbers, had a service ceiling of 38,000 feet, on paper. In practice, with combat load and realistic operational conditions, Japanese pilots could rarely exceed 32,000 feet, and at that altitude the aircraft was barely controllable, the pilot struggling with hypoxia even with oxygen mask in place. The P-47D Thunderbolt had a service ceiling of 43,000 feet and could maintain combat capability up to 40,000 feet. More importantly, at 30,000 feet, the altitude where Zero struggled, the Thunderbolt was just reaching its optimal performance envelope. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, Germany's primary fighter in the latter war years, could reach 39,000 feet, but its engine power fell off rapidly above 28,000 feet without the GM-1 nitrous oxide boost system, which was rarely available in sufficient quantities. The P-51D Mustang with its Packard-built Merlin engine maintained high power settings up to 38,000 feet and could patrol at those altitudes for hours, its pilot breathing pure oxygen from a system so reliable it was almost never a subject of maintenance concern. But statistics alone cannot capture what this meant to the men who lived and died in these circumstances. It meant that young pilots, 19-year-old conscripts in Japan, 20-year-old Hitler Youth volunteers in Germany, would climb into aircraft they knew to be obsolete, with equipment they knew to be deficient, to face enemies who could choose whether to fight or not based purely on tactical advantage. It meant that survival became a matter not of skill or courage, but of whether the enemy pilot decided you were worth the ammunition. Ensign Yasuo Kawara, a Japanese pilot who survived the war and later emigrated to America, wrote in his memoir, "By 1945, every mission felt like a form of ritual suicide. We would bow to the Emperor's portrait before we flew, but we knew, all of us knew, we were not being given the tools to fight honorably. We were being sent to die so that someone in Tokyo could write in a report that we had engaged the enemy with fierce determination." The Americans had oxygen. They had fuel. They had radios that worked, instruments that functioned, engines that didn't fail. We had our determination, and it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The broader strategic implications rippled outward from these individual engagements. With effective high-altitude escort, American bombers could strike targets with increasing impunity. The vaunted Japanese air defense network across the Pacific, bases at Rabaul, Truk, Saipan, were systematically destroyed because the defenders could not prevent American bombers from reaching their targets. Every airfield bombed meant fewer bases from which to launch interceptions. Every fuel depot destroyed meant less oxygen production for high-altitude operations. Every supply ship sunk meant fewer spare parts for oxygen regulators, fewer replacement bottles, fewer trained technicians. In Germany, the impact was even more devastating. When the 8th Air Force began deep penetration raids into Germany in 1943, protected by high-altitude escorts with drop tanks, the Luftwaffe faced an impossible choice: accept catastrophic losses attempting high-altitude interception, or cede control of German skies to the enemy. They chose to fight, and in the first 4 months of 1944, the period the Luftwaffe called the Great Bleeding, German fighter losses exceeded 1,000 aircraft per month, with pilot losses even more catastrophic because experienced pilots who might have survived a crash landing were instead being killed when their oxygen-deprived consciousness failed during emergency descent. By D-Day in June 1944, the Luftwaffe had been broken as an effective fighting force not primarily by being outfought, but by being systematically forced to fight at altitudes and durations where German aircraft and life support systems simply could not compete. German fighters in early 1944 were still formidable machines, and German pilots, those who survived, were accumulating skill. But they were drowning in the altitude war, suffocating at operational ceilings that American pilots treated as comfortable patrol altitudes. There is a photograph, taken by a reconnaissance aircraft over the Marianas in June 1944, that captures the symbol of this technological disparity with accidental poetry. In the foreground, a damaged Japanese Zero is visible, trailing smoke, clearly descending. In the background, at what analysts determined was approximately 35,000 feet based on atmospheric conditions, a formation of P-47s is visible as tiny cruciform shapes, still at patrol altitude, untouched and untouchable. The caption written by the photo analyst reads simply, "Enemy aircraft destroyed. Escort maintain station." But what the photograph really shows is the moment when Japanese fighter doctrine, built on lightness, maneuverability, and pilot skill, encountered the insurmountable wall of American industrial capacity. American factory workers, most of whom would never see combat, were winning the war every time they assembled another General Electric turbo supercharger, every time they tested another oxygen regulator, every time they filled another oxygen bottle. The young women working at the Wright Aeronautical Plant in Ohio, building the R-2600 engines for B-17s, were destroying Japanese air defenses as surely as the gunners who would eventually use those engines to fly over Tokyo. The workers at Pratt & Whitney in Connecticut, boring out cylinders for R-2800 radial engines, were killing German fighter pilots who would die of hypoxia before their aircraft ever burst into flames. This was the industrial reality of mid-20th century warfare, and it was a reality that neither Japanese nor German propaganda could obscure, no matter how much they emphasize spirit over material, will over technology. A pilot with the strongest will in the world still loses consciousness at 30,000 feet without oxygen. An aircraft designed with perfect aesthetic balance still cannot fly higher than its engine's power-to-weight ratio allows. And an empire that cannot produce sophisticated oxygen systems in sufficient quantities cannot win a war fought at the edge of breathable atmosphere. In the final months of the war, as American B-29 Superfortresses began raiding Japan from bases in the Marianas, they operated at altitudes between 30,000 and 35,000 feet, well above the effective ceiling of most Japanese interceptors. When Japanese fighters did manage to climb to engagement altitude, American P-51 escorts would already be established at 38,000 feet, and the ritual massacre would repeat. Over Osaka, over Nagoya, over Tokyo itself, Japanese fighters would struggle upward while American aircraft patrolled in the thin stratospheric air, their pilots comfortable, their engines powerful, their oxygen supplies unlimited. Some Japanese pilots reported experiencing moments of hallucinatory clarity at extreme altitude, their hypoxic brains producing vivid sensations even as their combat effectiveness disintegrated. They would see the American formations above them with crystalline sharpness, would feel the engine vibration with strange intensity, would hear sounds that might have been radio transmissions or might have been their own oxygen-starved neurons misfiring. And then they would wake up, if they woke up, at 15,000 feet in a dive, or in a rice paddy, or sometimes not at all, the aircraft having flown itself into the ground while the pilot sat unconscious in the cockpit, still strapped in, still holding the stick, having lost the battle against atmosphere and altitude before he ever encountered the enemy. The official Japanese military term for this was high-altitude incapacitation. The pilots had a different term. They called it the American ceiling, the altitude above which combat became physiologically impossible, and above which the enemy lived with casual permanence. There is a story, likely apocryphal, possibly true, but symbolically resonant regardless of its factual status, about a captured Japanese pilot being shown through an American aircraft carrier in late 1944. He was taken past stores of oxygen bottles, stacked by the hundreds. He was shown the sophisticated oxygen generation equipment, the testing facilities, the quality control processes. According to the story, he asked through his interpreter how many bottles were defective. The American officer told him, less than 1%. The Japanese pilot reportedly laughed, not with humor, but with the bitter recognition of someone who has just understood the full scope of his defeat. Japanese oxygen bottle failure rates, he told his captors, were running above 30% by 1944, and quality continued to decline as the war progressed. Whether or not this specific exchange occurred, the underlying truth is documented in countless supply reports and maintenance records. By early 1945, Japanese air units were cannibalizing oxygen systems from damaged aircraft to keep operational fighters supplied. They were mixing industrial oxygen with breathing oxygen despite contamination risks. They were reducing oxygen flow rates to stretch supplies, even though this guaranteed hypoxia at lower altitudes. They were, in essence, slowly suffocating their own pilots as surely as if they had removed their oxygen masks entirely. And every time an American escort fighter climbed to 35,000 feet and patrolled comfortably for 2 hours, that fighter was delivering a message more devastating than any bomb. We can afford to give our pilots unlimited oxygen, unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited time. We can build machines that operate in atmospheric conditions where yours cannot function. We can protect our bombers at altitudes where you cannot reach them, and when you try, we can dive down from even higher altitude and destroy you at our leisure. We can breathe where you suffocate. We live where you die. The post-war analysis of aerial combat conducted by both American and Allied intelligence services concluded that high-altitude escort capability was among the top 3 technological advantages that ensured Allied air superiority, alongside radar and productive capacity. But within that dry analytical framework was a human story of desperation, of young men struggling for breath in freezing cockpits while watching enemies operate with casual efficiency in conditions that would kill them in minutes. Lieutenant Yamamoto, the pilot watching Thunderbolts climb above him on that January morning in 1944, survived the war. He was shot down twice, wounded once, and eventually assigned to training duties when the shortage of experienced pilots became so acute that even moderately skilled survivors were too valuable to risk. In an interview conducted in 1986, he was asked what he remembered most clearly about his combat experience. He described not a specific dogfight, not a particular victory or defeat, but a moment very much like the one that opened this account. Watching American escorts climb away from him, climb to altitudes he could not reach, and understanding with perfect clarity that no amount of training, courage, or devotion to the Emperor could overcome the simple fact that his oxygen was running out and theirs was not. "We were brave," he said. "No one can say we were not brave. But bravery is not air. You cannot fly on honor." And the Americans understood something we did not, or something we understood too late. In modern war, the side that can equip its soldiers to fight in impossible conditions will always defeat the side that expects its soldiers to overcome impossible conditions through spirit alone. This is the epilogue written in vapor trails across the stratospheric blue of the Pacific War's later years. It is a story of oxygen bottles and turbo superchargers, of demand regulators and pressure suits, of all the unglamorous mechanical systems that allowed one side to breathe while the other suffocated. It is a reminder that wars are won not by the warriors who fight with greatest spirit, but by the societies that provide those warriors with the tools that make victory possible. And it is a truth that extends beyond oxygen systems and altitude records into the fundamental nature of democracy and industrial capacity. The American pilots who climbed to 40,000 feet in their Thunderbolts and Mustangs were not superior human beings to the Japanese and German pilots who struggled to reach 30,000 feet in their Zeros and Messerschmitts. They were not braver, not more skilled, not more devoted to their cause. They were simply the beneficiaries of a system, imperfect, often unjust, but phenomenally productive, that could afford to give every pilot a reliable oxygen system because there were factories that could build them, supply chains that could deliver them, and an economic base wealthy enough to treat such sophisticated systems as standard equipment rather than luxuries. In the end, the panic that Japanese pilots felt when American escorts climbed higher than their oxygen systems allowed was not merely fear of death, though it was that. It was the panic of understanding that they had been sent to fight a war their nation could not win, with tools their nation could not provide, against enemies whose advantages were so fundamental that no amount of sacrifice could overcome them. It was the panic of suffocation, yes, but also the panic of revelation, the moment when propaganda met physics and physics won. And perhaps this is the largest truth, that freedom and democracy and abundant societies do not triumph because of abstract moral superiority, but because they create systems that allow their defenders to breathe, to see, to think, to fight effectively when their enemies can barely function. The altitude war of 1943 and 1944 was not won by American courage or Japanese cowardice. It was won by American factories and supply chains and engineers and workers, all of whom provided their pilots with the unsexy, mechanical capability to operate in atmospheric conditions where the enemy could not survive. The sky, in the end, belonged not to the brave, but to the oxygenated.